Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, viewers, wherever you are located. Columbia Global Centers Nairobi warmly welcomes you to our continuation of our Africa and Africanity webinar series. This is an ongoing lecture series. Today's lecture is titled Religion and Religiosity of the Future. Please be sure to look out for next week's lecture, which is scheduled for November 20th, 4 p.m. Nairobi, 8 a.m. New York. Please look out for the announcement so that you can register again. If you registered last time, you will have to register again. If you have been following this series, you will recall we had to reschedule that particular lecture because of technical hitches. This webinar will be recorded and can be accessed on our YouTube page as well as on our website under videos in the coming week. To ensure your safety, some features have been disabled, these being audio and video sharing as well as screen share. You are welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The speaker will answer your questions at the end of the session. For more engaging, intriguing, and educative programs, please subscribe to our mailing list by visiting our Contact Us page on our website, globalcenters.columbia.edu/Nairobi. I would now like to hand over to our director, Dr. Murugi Dirango.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience, and welcome. As Pauline has said, my name is Murugi Dirango. I'm the director of Columbia Global Centers Nairobi. CGC Nairobi is one of 9 centers across the globe that have been established by Columbia University to create opportunities for shared learning and to deepen the nature of global dialogue. Today, we are very delighted to host the second in a series of 3 lectures on Africa and Africanity to be delivered by Professor Jesse Mugambi, Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Nairobi. These lectures are organized in collaboration with the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, University of Nairobi, and Columbia University's Department of Religion. Today's lecture is titled Future of Religion and Religiosity of the Future. The respondent to today's lecture will be Professor Joseph Soret, Professor and Chair, Department of Religion, Professor, Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, Columbia University. I will now introduce Professor Mugambi. Professor Jesse Mugambi is an alumnus of the University of Nairobi and a member of academic staff since 1976. In the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. On leave of absence, he taught at Rice University, Texas as a visiting Mellon Distinguished Professor in the Department of Religion. He was also a guest professor at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, a visiting professor at Emmanuel College, Toronto, Canada, and visiting professor at the University of South Africa, Pretoria. He also served as director of Starehe Boy Center, Nairobi. Among other responsibilities, he has been resource person for the All-African Conference of Churches since 1974, World Student Christian Federation since 1974, and World Council of Churches since 1975. His professional training is in education and communication, and his academic specialization include philosophy, theology, and religious studies. At the University of Nairobi, he served as chair of the department, associate dean, faculty of arts, academic registrar. He has authored and co-authored several books and articles on philosophy and religion. His expanded bio can be found on our website. It is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Mugambi to give his lecture. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for inviting us to this series of lectures. We don't take it for granted, and we congratulate Columbia University and especially the center in Nairobi. We hope that this is only the beginning of a long series because we want to communicate with the world. To introduce this lecture today, I have a long-term friend and a colleague, and one of the most distinguished of our leaders in this country. It is Reverend Dr. Samuel Cobia, who was at one time General Secretary of the National Council of Churches of Kenya, then was General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, and now we are honored to have him as the Chairman of the National Cohesion in our Republic. We are old friends from student days, and we would like him to say a few words of introduction before I begin my lecture. Dr. Cobia.
Thank you, Professor Jesse Mugambi. I'll just refer to you as Jesse, because as you have very clearly seen, we go back many years. As far back as the late 1960s, Jesse and I began our long ecumenical journey, which started in 1969, when we both joined the ecumenical movement through the World Students Christian Federation, Africa region, of which we both served as staff at different times. But Jesse Mugambi worked for the World Students Christian Federation, Africa region, much longer than I did, but I continued to be deeply involved. Also, we were together in working with or sometimes serving the All Africa Conference of Churches and the World Council of Churches, as he has mentioned. During the times when the liberation struggles against late colonialism, particularly in Southern Africa, and the Portuguese colonialism, Jesse Mugambi and I were deeply involved through the students' work, and later on, the ecumenical movement. It was also a time when there were discussions about the rapid social change in Africa, and at a time when clearly there was a social consciousness, and especially in addressing the oppressed consciousness of African people. And we needed a liberated consciousness, and those are the struggles that we had. Now, looking back at 1969, Professor John Beatty, who is a compatriot of ours, wrote the book, African Religions and Philosophy, a book that has since become classic. And it was at the time when John Beatty made the famous statement that Africans are notoriously religious, way back in 1969. Now let's see, as we listen to Professor Jesse Mugambi, whether Africans religiously are notoriously religious still holds true. Of course, a lot has changed since the time of our youth with my good friend Jesse. What has not changed is the fundamentals of religiosity in Africa, and particularly when it comes to life. Religion remains at the center of life for the African people. And therefore, I'm very pleased to make these very few introductory remarks to Professor Jesse Mugambi's third lecture in a series which I must say I'm very, I feel having missed that, and the religiosity of the future is a lecture that I very much look forward to listening to. Now, there are two most sacred documents in Kenya that are, now, these two documents are very key in helping us to understand how Kenyans as a people, and I would say not only Kenyans, but Africans look at religion and life. Our national anthem opens with these words: "O God of all creation, bless this our land and nation." Our anthem is a prayer, and that's how it opens. "O God of all creation, bless this our land and nation." This other sacred national document is Kenyan Constitution 2010, which opens its preamble in these words: "We, the people of Kenya, acknowledging the supremacy of the Almighty God of all creation," and then it continues. Let me quickly move to Article number 10 of the Constitution, which is on national values and principles of governance, which are grounded on our national ethos, which itself is religious. Now, I have decided to make reference to those two documents because they may be considered as secular. But indeed, those opening ones make it very clear that they are religiously grounded. At a time when the West is tending to gravitate towards secularism, Africa remains religiously rooted. Not only the Kenyan Constitution, but the constitutions of many other African countries are very much religiously grounded. And now, I wanted to say a few words about our national values and the ethos, because as the Commission on National Cohesion and Integration, we very much use this Article 10 of the Constitution, which is on national values and the principles of governance. It is categorized into 4 sections. The first one being on patriotism, national unity, sharing and the devolution of power, the rule of law, democracy, and the participation of the people. The second section is on human dignity, equity, social justice, inclusiveness, equality, human rights, non-discrimination, and the protection of the marginalized. The third is on good governance, integrity, transparency, and accountability. And the fourth is on sustainable development. What I would like to say is that there is need in Kenya and Africa in general. There is need for national attitude positive, and these can be found in our religion. Above all, we as the National Cohesion and Integration Commission do have initiatives that are always conscious of the need to go beyond mere awareness raising of the issues identified in our sacred documents, influencing positive change of attitudes and ultimately behavior changes of leaders in Kenya and the society in general. And for the benefit of this is for the benefit of the greater and the sustainable good of our society. These are what I refer to as fundamentals that have not changed, even though a lot has changed since Jesse and I were young students struggling to understand what makes Africa to be notoriously religious. And I think by listening to Jesse, we could say that we will then know whether indeed Professor Johnny Beatty was right then and today. With these few remarks, it is indeed my privilege and pleasure to have had make those remarks before Jesse Mugambi starts his lecture. Thank you for listening to me, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cobia. We have come a very long way, and we still have a long way to go. And not just the two of us, because we represent a generation. In the last lecture, I tried to emphasize the point that we all human beings are relatives. And the tendency for some of us to belittle others, look down upon others, is a mistake. And it is a serious mistake, especially when that kind of behavior, that kind of talk, and that kind of attitude is made by people who consider themselves highly civilized, highly educated, and all those other adjectives. We are all relatives. This lecture is now talking about religion. We who are in Africa are beneficiaries of religions that have come from outside. Christianity, Islam, and even to some extent other religions that are being introduced to us. It is ironical and paradoxical that those nations, those places where those religions came from are becoming less and less religious, while Africa is becoming increasingly more and more religious. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is whether civilization, as it has been brought to us, means abandoning religion. If we look at the constitutions of the continent of Africa, it's very interesting to note that very few, if any, of African countries have national anthems that are not either hymns or poems of religion. And this speaks for itself, that for us in Africa, religion is so important that it is an integral part of our self-understanding and existence. We have a tendency, coming from the same places where evangelization came, tending to encourage us to abandon or belittle religion, because civilization these days seems to be associated with secularization and secularism. The purpose of this lecture is for us to raise the question as to whether it is possible to be normal and to abandon religion. Dr. Cobia has introduced this session well by referring to Professor John Beatty. The first sentence of his book, African Religions and Philosophy, is Africans are notoriously religious. He passed on last year, and he passed on before I had discussed that phrase with him. I don't think he meant notoriously. He meant incurably religious. And it seems to me that this applies not just to Africans. I said earlier that we are all related. Humans are incurably religious. They're incurably religious because we are not responsible for our being in this world. We owe our existence to powers beyond ourselves. And when we behave or think or teach as if we own the world and as if we are responsible for being in the world, we have made a terrible mistake. Maybe theologically one might say we have committed an original sin. I'm not sure that we're going to make our slides available. If we are, it's okay. If we're not, you'll still be able to see them when it comes in YouTube. The second slide in my presentation actually is a cemetery. The oldest cemetery so far discovered by archaeologists. And it happens to have been found in our country. It is a cemetery of 600 people who were buried there 15,000 years ago. Not 5,000, not 500, not 1,500, 15,000 years ago. And at the same place, it is the same place where the oldest complete human being was found. Those of you who are watching, who are not from Kenya, I'm not advertising tourism, but I would like to invite you to a museum because the oldest complete gentleman is in the Nairobi Museum, found in Kenya. And that was at the time when humans were migrating a little further south from where we are, northwards, coming to North Africa, then to Europe, then to Asia. The point I want to emphasize here is that this religiosity, our acknowledgement that we are not responsible for bringing ourselves into this world, and we are not responsible for what happens afterwards, except that we leave behind all those errors that we make for our future generations to enjoy or errors to suffer. If we recognize that we are not responsible for our being in this world, then indeed we are being religious. It worries me and concerns me that we are being encouraged by the same agencies, or some of them, that brought Christianity to us, that now it is time maybe for us to think again. And we are suggesting, I am suggesting that this is not the right way to go. Maybe it is time that we begin to re-evangelize Europe and North America. Maybe now we could go on to the slides. Now here are the slides. I've just done my introduction. Dr. Samuel Cobia began by quoting John Beatty. I like to tell all of you in this webinar that we are not compared notes with Samuel Cobia. Africans indeed are notoriously religious. This is the first sentence in John Beatty's book titled African Religions and Philosophy. The religiousness of Africans was not injected into our consciousness by missionaries, whether Christian or Muslim. Africans never engaged in conflict over religion. That was taboo. This fact should challenge Africans in the present and future generations, whether we should ever fight over doctrines and rituals of religions introduced from other cultures. I emphasize again, Africans did not and would not fight over religion. This business of fighting over religion has been introduced to us. There are more fundamental concerns to preoccupy us, especially at this time when ideologies pollute our religious consciousness. Nobody teaches a child about God. This is one of very important teachings in Africa. Instead, the child grows up in wisdom and in truth, if obedient, observant, and compliant. There are three ultimate concerns of religion. I don't mean African religion, I don't mean Christianity, I don't mean Islam, I mean all religiosity. It's a question of ultimate origin, or we might put it in Old English, whence, that is, where and when in history has everything begun. We only make guesses about where we have come from, where we came from, and how. We were not there. It's like a child trying to reflect on where they came from. We all do not know how we were conceived. We don't know how we were gestated, and we don't know how we were born. We don't know about our infancy. We discover ourselves very, very much later when we have been brought up, if we survive. The second question is about ultimate purpose. Why are we here? I mean, not in this webinar, even though this webinar is important. Ultimately, why are we here? We can even ask, why are we here asking these questions now? This is a very fundamental question. It's not a philosophical question. It's not a scientific question. It is a religious question. And the third question is about ultimate destiny. Or in Old English, one might ask, whither is it all leading? Where will it end? If we would have an answer to this question, which is a correct answer, we would be God, we would be the creator. The same force that brought us into being is the same one that is responsible to answer this question. That's what religion is about. The universe preceded us. We should not behave as if it is ours. We belong in it for us to bequeath to future generations. It does not belong to us. Future generations are entitled to enjoy it also. And when I talk about the universe, we also mean where we come from, where we are. But there's a tendency to behave among some of us as if the world or parts of it belong to us. It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to future generations. We are here for a purpose. Focus on expectations that will outlive us. The ultimate destiny is beyond us. The best we can do is anticipate the fruits of our striving beyond our lifetime. We humans, without exception, are too preoccupied with the penultimate, forgetting the ultimate. This slide summarizes what I have just tried to say. Those who have written and taught about Africa talk about paganism and animism and so on. These words are derogatory. They are insulting. It is as if other nations did not have those, if you can use the word, original religions. All of them had. So on this slide, you might perhaps think about people as they define themselves. And as I was preparing this lecture, I was laughing and enjoying myself. If the first two words of each of these circles would refer to the different parts of the world, And the second set of words would refer to traditional religion. We would actually observe, and I hope agree, all of us, that there are no nations, no peoples without traditional religion. All of us do have our traditional religion. But then on top of it, and above it, and beyond it, we have introduced others. So if we think then about our African traditional religion, the Europeans have their traditional religion, the Asians have their traditional religions, there are no people without traditional religion. And these written religions, Islam, Christianity, or Buddhism, are not religions that now apply to particular nations or particular peoples. These are hybrids that came on top of the traditional religions that we are talking about. At the beginning of my presentation this afternoon, or it's afternoon here, it's a morning elsewhere, I referred to the oldest cemetery known, which is in northern Kenya. This is what the archaeologists found. And for those who are interested in tourism, it's one of the tourist attractions. 15,000 years ago, people already knew of the beyond. Religion as a focus in society. In my view, religion is much, much more than Christianity. It is much, much more than Islam. It's much, much more than Judaism, much, much more than Hinduism. I refer to these because they have scriptures, but we have to remember that these scriptures that define these religions did not begin as scripts. What people wrote was to reduce to writing beliefs and aspirations that they already had. And we have a tendency to make the scriptures ends in themselves without appreciating that scriptures are means to an end. Religion has various dimensions. The ritual dimension is one of them. And when we think about ritual, we're talking about activities that point beyond the activities themselves. When Muslims go to celebrate Ramadan, when Christians celebrate Easter, and when all these other religions celebrate their rituals, the rituals are not ends in themselves. They are pointing beyond themselves. I want now to go a little further and point out that the denominations and sects that come with scriptural religions, we might say are aberrations. They are probably distortions of the original intention of the original religion. I understand that Islam now has as many as 74 sects or denominations. Christianity has more than 40,000, maybe even over 50,000, depending on how you count. And I hear Buddhism, I have read that Buddhism also had all these denominations. Apparently, scriptures might be the problem rather than the solution for religiosity. Without scriptures, communities remain religious without quarrels about words. But we introduce scriptures, then we start fighting about who is right and who is wrong. I'm not aware that African people, before the introduction of these scriptural religions, ever fought about religiosity. In fact, as children, we would be discouraged from arguing at all about religion because religion precedes us and we leave it behind. I want now to go a little further on this analysis of mine. For reasons other than religious, the world seems to have been partitioned so that some countries are associated with some religions. Oh, Christianity in Africa and Asia and Europe, Islam in Asia and in Africa, Buddhism in India, in Japan, in Thailand, in China, Judaism in Israel, with a few immigrants here and there. It is as if we can apportion religions to territories or to races or to tribes. I am not convinced at all that this is the way it ought to be. And I would like to suggest that if it were not for politics, if it were not for power, these kinds of arguments would not arise. John Beatty made a statement, a very profound statement, that nobody teaches a child God. In other words, our awareness of the beyond does not require volumes of books or scrolls. I teach a course called Phenomenology of Religion, and one of the books that I enjoy very much is by the late Ninian Smart. And he has these 7 dimensions of religion: the ritual dimension, the narrative or mythic dimension, the experiential or emotional dimension, the social and institutional dimension, the ethical and legal dimension, the doctrinal and philosophical dimension, and the material dimension. I find this template very useful. And if we apply it across nations, across cultures, it will be difficult to argue about any people having no religion. All of us humans are religious as long as we begin to ask ourselves these ultimate questions of ultimate origin, ultimate purpose, and ultimate destiny. I would like also to reflect a little further about this question on what religion is about in society. Religion does help us to express ourselves. Much of art in all cultures is actually fundamentally religious. Much of ritual in all cultures happens to be primarily religious. And much of mythology happens to be religious. And this particular one about myth, I would like to refer you to a book that is still in print and very interesting about the gods and myths of Northern Europe. And as I was reading it, it occurred to me that even the rituals of Christianity are actually derived not from Israel, not from Asia, but from Nordic myths and legends. It also, of course, has to do with the social values and moral values and doctrinal values. And many of the artworks that we find in every culture are primarily religious. So we can ask ourselves the question, even as we talk about secularization and secularism, is it possible for humans to escape religiosity? I'm convinced that it is not possible because of the kind of being the human being is, preoccupied with these ultimate questions about ultimate origin, ultimate purpose, and ultimate destiny. Let me now move to another aspect that relates to religion generally. Society functions under at least seven aspects. One is polity, which has to do with social influence, economy, which has to do with resources, ecology, which has to do with environment, family, which has to do with community, ethics, which has to do with morals, beauty, Actually, beauty doesn't have to do with being nice looking and so on. It has to do with a sense of proportion, and depending on how we have been socialized, some things are proportional to us, but not to others. That's why human beings say beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, and the religion, which has to do with ultimate meaning. This slide need not delay us much longer, because it's basically an echo of what I have already said before, and I would wish that in your own time, you can reflect about it further. Now, having talked about perspectives on knowing reality, our senses, each one of our senses helps us to appreciate our perception as we experience. Those with eyes, what do we see? The interesting thing is that when we are beholding, when we are watching whatever we are watching, beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. And each of us sees only that which we have been socialized and brought up to see. Here, those with ears, what do we hear? We hear what we want to hear, depending on how we have been brought up and depending on the competencies of our sense of hearing. Those with a sense of touch, what do we feel with our senses? The interesting thing is that we think we feel the same, but we don't, because the processing of what we sense depends very much on the inner dynamics of our bodies. Smell, yes, some of us have a sense of smell, some don't. Just like some of us have a sense of sight and others don't. Some have a sense of hearing and others don't. Some have a sense of taste, others don't. All humans are differently gifted. There is nobody with perfect sensibility or no sense organs. Thus we have differing levels of perception and also different capabilities in processing whatever we happen to perceive. For this reason, we should refrain from judging others, avoid claiming that our perception is better than that of other people. The closest we can get to the truth is to admit that we are different. This slide is just a summary of what I have said earlier. Now I would like to talk about conversion as I near the end of my presentation. There's a tendency for some people from some places to believe and to practice the idea that they can convert others to their own way of believing. The majority of believers in every religion are inducted as children. They follow the religious routine of their parents. The process of secularization and the ideology of secularism arising from it has already slowed down and in some countries reversed the numerical growth of Christianity. Religion is much more than memorizing doctrines and participating in rituals. It is a way of life based on a particular worldview, which is entrenched in the culture. The crisis in African Christianity is that the teachings and rituals are foreign. The source languages are Hebrew and Greek, and the missionary languages are such as English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, German, and so on, the languages of the colonizing powers during the missionary era. In this process, evangelization becomes ideological propaganda. It may also be observed that African Islam, for the majority of Muslims, it may also be observed that African Islam for the majority of African Muslims is also foreign. That's why it is Arabic. And to think that there are some languages that are sacred, that are higher than others, is not right, in my view. This slide is, again, a summary, an attempt to summarize what we've just said earlier. The first few years of a child's growth is when these deep insights are imparted. But when the children grow older, they may abandon them, they may modify them, depending on the ideological orientations, depending on the schooling that they go through. I now want to talk about conversion, or if I can use a simpler word, influence. The question that one should ask is on what justification there is for conversion. And when you look at conversion in the African context, it's very interesting if you appreciate this diagram. This process of conversion, imagine, may not be all that innocent. You convert by sometimes bribing, extending favors, convincing, by persuasion, by compelling, sometimes even forcing. And when we think we are successful because we have won converts, we should be self-critical again to find out from ourselves whether the conversion we have done is a genuine one, or indeed maybe anti-religious. I make these remarks as an African who have observed and experienced very painfully the way in which our own heritage has been distorted by religions coming from outside, as if African religiosity was not adequate for us. Now I would like to come towards the end and talk about convergence of philosophy, religion, and science. Philosophy affirms humans as sapient beings, endowed with good taste, good sense, intelligence, and wisdom. This affirmation, however, does not entitle philosophers to despise religion. On the contrary, religion reminds philosophers that there is much more to be thought, said, and written than everything that is associated with the human achievements. In my studies, I came across this gentleman. I find difficulty in pronouncing his name because I don't speak German, Ludwig Winkenstein, who wrote that whatever needs saying can be said quite simply and quite clearly. The rest should be passed over in silence. So when I have pain, I say, ouch, and that is a statement by itself. And in Africa, when there was an enemy around, we would say, ooh-wee, and we will know that there was a stranger in our midst. Balanced knowledge and practice. Each of the pillars of culture that I have discussed are important, and they should be held in balance. A society that gives too much attention to one or other of the pillars of culture, ignoring the rest, will be crippled. Maintaining a balance is difficult, especially because experts in each pillar of culture will campaign for attention, trying to influence governance policy in their favor. Civilization at its best achievement is at its best achievement when culturally balanced. On this point, I would like to refer you, as I have referred myself, to a book by Professor Jared Diamond, Professor of Population Geography at the University of California. It's titled How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And he has illustrated the tragedy of lopsided development. Another one that perhaps you might wish to read is the one by Professor Ali Mazrui, a Kenyan, recently passed on, the Africans a triple heritage. I would fail in my duty in this lecture if I did not refer as a joke, but a serious joke, about Martin Luther. We celebrated the 500th anniversary of the Reformation not long ago. And Martin Luther, who was considered very progressive, made this statement about Copernicus. People give ear to an abstract astrologer, that is Copernicus, who strove to show that the earth revolves, not the heavens or the firmament, the sun and the moon. Whoever wishes to appear clever must devise some new system, which of all systems is of course the very best. This fool, that is Copernicus, wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy. But the sacred scripture tells us that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, not the earth. Luther had erroneously equated Christian teachings with scientific laws. The scriptures had made him blind. Likewise, Sigmund Freud considered religion to be based on an illusion, as if omniscience is essential in the definition of human identity. On the contrary, it is the admission of ignorance and inadequacy that best defines human conscience. I think this is a convenient point for me to stop my slideshow, and I hope that I've convinced you that this question about the future of religion and religiosity demands of us that we admit our ignorance rather than continue to pretend that we know everything when, in fact, the unknowable remains unknowable. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Mugambi, for that talk, for your lecture. I'm sure our audience have enjoyed it as much as I have, and I'm sure they have several questions. I ask you to please write them in the Q&A box, and Professor Mugambi will look at them and respond to them after we hear from our respondent. So our respondent today is Joseph Soret, Professor of Religion and African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University, where he is also chair of the Department of Religion and directs the Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. As an interdisciplinary scholar of religion and race in the Americas, Joseph employs primarily historical and literal approaches to the study of religion in Black communities and cultures in the United States. His first book, Spirit in the Dark, A Religious History of Racial Aesthetics, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016, and illuminates how religion has figured in debates about Black art and culture across the 20th century. A second book, The Holy, Holy Black, the Ironies of an American Secular, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. Additionally, Joseph is editing an anthology, The Sexual Politics of Black Churches, which will be published by Columbia University Press. Joseph's scholarly work has been supported with grants from Henry Luce Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the E. Rhodes and Leon B. Carpenter Foundation, the Arcus Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Louisville Institute, the Forum for Theological Exploration, and Yale University's Institute for Sacred Music. His research has been published in academic journals and anthologies, and his writing and commentary have also appeared in a range of popular media outlets, including ABC News, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, as well as on the BBC and NPR. Please join me in welcoming Professor Soret. Karibu, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Ndurango, for the invitation. I want to also thank very quickly Pauline Mathoni and the entire Global Center Nairobi team for the invitation and the hospitality to participate in this conversation and respond to this incredibly insightful and thought-provoking lecture. Before offering just some brief responses and opening it up, I can see that the chat room is already quite active. So I know folks want to engage with the professor directly. And so I will very briefly offer, I guess, some general remarks. I also want to acknowledge and thank Dr. Samuel Cobia for the invitation, for the introductory remarks and thinking about the lecture and hearing your remarks that segued perfectly into the introduction to the lecture brought me back immediately to 1994, my first class in Black theology in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with a Dr. Leonard Lovett, where he introduced me to Dr. Mabidi's book, right? So it was really just a flashback, even as we move forward to be brought back to Dr. Mabidi's work, right, recently deceased, which continues to have an incredible amount of impact on the field. And in thinking about that, and then moving forward to think about a number of the themes that Dr. Mugambi's lecture has outlined for us, I guess first I want to acknowledge how significantly the field has grown in terms of the study of religion, to think about the complexity, the history, the contributions of African religiosity, of what are called in the context of the Americas and the Caribbean, African derived religious practices, to recognize, right, that speak to the critique that Dr. Mugambi has suggested about the way in which Africa has often figured in this history of the West, right? That the field has grown dramatically over the last several decades to recognize the distinctiveness as well as the universality of the contributions of African religious worlds to, right, religion in general, right? And I think that even as the field has grown, we are growing as a world to recognize this contribution, right? And so much of what I heard and learned in the lecture in thinking about the relationship between religions that come from the outside to religious traditions across the continent, to thinking about narratives of secularism that are tied to the progress of the West and tell a particular story about the West, have, I think if I heard you right, Professor Mugambi, have in some ways uncritically adopted a narrative that aligns itself with colonialism, right? That figures Africa in a particular way that even prior to an engagement with the richness of African heritage and culture and religiosity has already made a decision about how to think about Africa's contribution, which doesn't allow for a fair hearing of the complexity and distinctiveness of Africa's contribution, even as we increasingly know, right, of Africa as the original site or Africa as the cradle of civilization. The narrative of the West does not allow for the complexity of that story. And so what I guess what I would just very quickly say, and here I'm thinking about a book that I read that in my first semester of grad school. It's not a book that we even continue to read much. It began as a dissertation at Columbia University, and I, in some ways, am signaling the context of our conversation is one that's facilitated by Columbia University today, which is, like the lecture today, offers a critique of colonialism, right? And here I'm thinking about Professor Mugambi, your comments about the ways in which Africa, as notoriously religious, or as to your point, incurably religious, is very much a human phenomena, right? It's not that Africa was behind. It's not that Africa lacked the capacity of civilization, but it's the West's narrative of Africa in a particular way that, right, posited as the world was moving forward that Africa and Africans, and the same was said about African Americans, even in the context of North America, right? That somehow, as the US was telling a story of itself as moving forward towards science and reason, that African Americans, right, even in the West, were unable to move forward with that narrative of secularization, right? This narrative tells us less about African Americans or about Africans and more about how the West and white scholars narrating the history of the West imagined Black and brown people, right? And so here the book that I would mention, right, because in this description was not just about religion in general, but it was about which kind of religions were part of the past, or which kind, right? And Africa then became the example, even as Africa was not really adequately engaged. Africa became the example of what was past, even as that was not the case. And the book that I'm speaking about is what began as a dissertation in the anthropology department at Columbia. It was called Primitive Traits by Frederick Davenport. And he's responding in this book, written right at the turn of the 20th century, is responding in a moment in which the maps of colonialism are attempting to be reimagined, whether we think of W.B. Du Bois talking about the problem of the color line, right? And being about the relationship between darker and light-skinned peoples of the world, or whether we think about the World Parliament of Religions, which was convened in Chicago and brought representatives from around the world, including Africa, right? That there was a way in which, as there's an effort to reimagine religion for the modern world, anything that was associated with the past or what was deemed primitive was then, right, claimed to be associated with Black and brown people and being associated with African continent. And what was pointed out in Davenport's book is that this primitivism, right, even if it was being created and imagined a particular way, was by no means simply a phenomena created by Black and brown people or sustained by Black and brown people. And when one looks just even at the table of contents of Frederick Davenport's book, and this book did not provide a solution to the problems that have been raised today, but what it does help to do, even 100 years ago, which I think is apparent in the lecture today, is clarify that this so-called primitivism was, right, very much a global phenomena, right? And in the context of the United States, there was especially a concern with revivalism, an emotionally expressive religion, right? Religion that involved the body, religion that involved maybe dance and screaming and shouting, right? That this was something that in the context of the United States was described as a religion of the slaves, right? But in the context of Davenport's book, he points to Scottish-Irish revivals in Kentucky. He points to what is called the ghost dance amongst Native Americans against in the communities of American Indians, right? He looks at the New England awakenings associated with Jonathan Edwards, or even with John Wesley, and sort of we think of Methodism as it's taking shape in North America. And the primitivism that was popularly described as being associated only with Africans, Davenport's book suggests, and I think persuasively, that this phenomena also was very readily apparent within a variety of white communities, right? Communities described as white, whether Scottish-Irish or American Puritans, but also, right, within Native American and Black and brown communities. This primitivism was, even if we don't want to agree that that's the language to describe it, was very much emblematic of the human phenomena that we identify as religion. So I'm going to stop there to suggest and affirm what I thought was one of the central insights across the many examples of this incredibly helpful lecture today. Thank you again, Professor Mugambi, is that, right, part of the work of recognizing the complexity and continued contributions of African religiosity to the world is about, right, discarding with a particular narrative that sees religion through a colonial framework, right? To recognize the complexity, not just of Africa and the continent, but the way in which a range of religious realities continue to shape the way in which we understand the modern world. Thank you all for the invitation. Thank you as well, Professor Mugambi, for the lecture today.
Thank you very much, Professor Soret. I know you may have to leave soon, but we have a few questions, and if you can take one question as you on your way before you go. Yes, I think there are sub-questions we have there, a Q&A. Thank you. What is your take? This is from Ukoha Ngombia. What is your take on the Africans seemingly losing our Africanness as a result of these foreign religions? Can we ever regain our African identity?
This is an excellent question. And again, I apologize that I have to run to a meeting that began 10 minutes ago. I want this conversation, we could go on in really interesting ways. And I'll just try to very quickly respond to this question, because this is actually a question that I get often, right? Even in the American context, about what happens in the context of Christianity as a driving force in the American Christianity, or I should say within sort of Black religious practices in America. And I think there's something similar here. It's one thing, right, to think about the imposition of Western Christianity on the African, in the same way my students think about Christianity being imposed on Black Americans. And there's no way to discount the degree to which Christianity and colonialism were linked in a set of asymmetrical power relations. But what is also, I think, just as interesting is what have, in the US, Black Americans, and on the continent, what did Africans do with Christianity? It's not simply a case that Africans were a blank slate and Christianity was imposed. Yes, there is this colonial lens, but we also know that there was a longer history of Christianity coming to Africa prior to colonialism vis-a-vis the West, right? That there is what we might think of as an indigenous history of African Christianity that is not solely about the imposition of Europe, right? And we could think of the Orthodox tradition as it made its way, right? And that there are representations of Africans within the context of a Christian Bible prior to colonialism. One could also say, though, even within the colonial exchange and imposition of Christianity, that what Africans did with Christianity in light of their own sense of the world, their own religious heritage prior to colonialism, was something entirely distinct. Right? What it meant to take up Christianity did not just mean to take on the colonial master's religion. In fact, what Africans did with Christianity might constitute something entirely distinctive that might represent a longer history of African Christianity that tells you as much about the cultural history and traditions of the continent as it does about the logics of colonialism. Right? And so I think that to me is what is interesting. African religiosity and African identity may have been impacted, but to say that African identity was entirely lost, I think discounts the power, right? The ingenuity of Africans as Christianity was being imposed, right? So that would be my initial response. I think it's a great question and points to, right, actually that insight from the lecture. Colonialism was not the be-all, beginning and end-all. It is a definitive moment, but what Africans were doing before and continued to do in the face of a new set of relationships is still an important way to think about the relationship between Africa and Christianity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Soret. And we've enjoyed your contribution, and we'll continue with the questions with the other panel members that will still be here. So thank you, Professor Soret.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. There's a question here from Eve Makula. She's asking, and maybe Reverend Cobia, you could take this. How can we detangle religion, racism, power, and capitalism?
The question is a very interesting one. Disentangling religion, capitalism, or ideology. Basically, I hear that question as a question about religion and ideology. When I look at what became the basis of communism and even socialism is actually a biblical idea that we find in Pauline theology, where he talks of from each one according to ability, to each one according to need. That really is the basis, and that is what influenced Karl Marx in working out his own ideology of communism. What needs to be done is to go much more deeply in what has eventually become the standard Christianity or standard religion for that matter, and ideology. And these are what usually are discussed in a very superficial way. So in my view, what we need to do to disentangle these religion and ideology is to have a deep understanding of where the main ideas in ideology came from and why they happened at the time they happened. I think Professor Jesse Mugambi has very clearly shown that the influence of our understanding of what Christianity is and what even Islam is has been influenced by the need to dominate. And there is where I would say, when it comes to disentangling, is to see what it is that is basically as brought as a way of dominating others, denigrating others, so that they will convince yourself, your community, and others that a certain community has a deficiency in their life, in this respect, say religion, then what you need to do is to show that Africans do not have a religion, and therefore there is need to evangelize them and to change them. Or if you want to justify colonialism, then you will show that you are civilizing others, or that they do not have a basis of economy. So we need to dominate them so that we can help them from themselves, so to speak. So I would say that we need to be more, we have to go more fundamentally in understanding what it is that leads to some people or some ideas wanting to dominate others, or a culture to dominate others, so as to justify the relationship that is being created, whether it's that of a colonizer and colonized, or an oppressor and oppressed. So I think, in my view, that is where we need to go fundamentally if we want to disentangle the three that you have mentioned.
Thank you very much, Reverend Cobia. We have two questions here, which I think Professor Mugambi can take. From an anonymous attendee, they ask, how can Africans recover their identity and therefore agency in global debates, discourses? And then we have another question from Pauline Nabuko, asking, what makes Professor Mugambi think about religion, if Africa, religion in Africa being incurable?
Yes, let me begin with the last one, with the second one, about incurability. Yes, Pauline and Mbiti begins from Mbiti, because Mbiti had said are notoriously religious, and I incurability is my adjective. Mbiti's was notorious, notoriety. Again, I say Mbiti passed on before we had discussed that joke, but I had already modified the adjective to incurability. Mbiti was joking, because actually being religious is not something to be notorious about, and to be incurable means that even if angels came, they will not perhaps cure Africans from being religious. To say that being religious is something bad or wrong or something to be ashamed about is a mistake. In my view, it is part of human nature to be religious. And even if we try to run away from religiosity, it keeps coming back in various ways. So for me, the best way perhaps to answer the question is to ask how we can responsibly handle or harness this aspect of our consciousness, which deals with ultimate questions of ultimate purpose, ultimate destiny, and ultimate origin. And I think that Africans do not have to apologize for being religious. What they need to do is to be accountable with their religiosity. The second aspect, I would respond with a reference to some insight I got from a Mennonite missionary who used to work in Kenya. He was also passed on several years ago. His name was Donald Jacobs. And he likened Christianity to a jockey. The jockeys are the people who ride horses in horse races in competition. And he suggested that a good jockey will not continue riding a horse which has become old or which has become unable to run. A good jockey is hired to run good fast horses. And he suggested that Christianity seems to have started with a jockey that was willing to accept it. And when the society abused or got tired of it, Christianity moved on. And it's a very powerful metaphor. It may not be completely correct, but there's maybe some truth in it, because Europe seems to have got tired of Christianity now. It started in southeastern part of Europe. It went on all the way to the west. They seem to have got tired of it. It's come to Africa. We hope that Africa will not get tired of it, because if Africa gets tired of it, maybe Europe will be ready for it again. And so Christianity seems to be coming back to Europe via Africa. And so who knows? Maybe Africa, maybe Europe and North America will be re-evangelized by Africans. Incidentally, as you asked this question, whoever asked it, I don't know whether you know for a fact, but the largest congregation in Europe is in Kiev, and it is headed by a Nigerian. And there are very few Africans worshiping there. But the pastor head of that church is Nigerian. So the future is not necessarily going to be a repeat of the past. It's going to be different. I can also comment a little about the African presence in Europe and North America. And they have taken their religiosity from here. And from what I gather, a new wave of religiosity is happening in Europe and North America among those who have found their home, not of the generation that came from Africa during the days of slavery, but those who are coming as migrant workers and eventually taking citizenship in those countries. So the agenda is not over yet. I think the jury is still in session. While I still have the floor on this particular one, I also want to give another analogy think about a drop of water that starts from the top of the mountain. I was born and live in the southern slopes of Mount Kenya. And when the rain falls, the drops that come from the top of the mountain end up in the Indian Ocean. Each drop ends up there. But as it gets on there, it goes on picking other drops, and it goes also nourishing the vegetation as it goes down. Maybe the gospel is like that. And if we think about it, then every drop that has gone to make the ocean is important for that ocean. And so we should not underestimate our role in the drama of divine creation.
Thank you very much, Professor Mugambi. Our time is fast coming to an end, but I think we can take 2 more questions, and I'll give one question to Reverend Cobia. There's a question from Dr. Paul Mwangi, wanting to know if human beings are so religious, why is it difficult to have one religion in the context of globalization? And then we'll have a second question to Professor Mugambi. How is it the question rather to do with redeeming true or pure religion and not disentangling religion? The latter surely is a recipe for secularism. This is from Abraham Nganga. So let's start with Reverend Cobia. Is it possible to have a global religion?
Well, I think it is very difficult to have a world religion because religion is the social organization on how to live a faith. And the social aspect of it, that's why it becomes religion. Religious organized. There are vested interests in organized religion, and which has to do, once again, let me come to dominance. And to the extent that human beings come together and they form a social organization around a faith, then it is very difficult to have one religion for a world religion. Of course, we do have global religions because the Pope is the hand of all those who associate themselves with Roman Catholicism. There are, of course, other Catholic religions like Old Catholic, or in some places where in China they have 2 different types of Roman Catholicism. But to the extent that there's power involved, and I think this is where really the problems comes in. To the extent that you want to use more power, being able to dominate and exploit others, then it becomes virtually impossible to have a global religion, even within one religion like Christianity or Islam, not even to talk of different types of religions like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc., becoming one. I think it's because of power, it's because of dominance, it's because of human tendency, that propensity to want to dominate others, that makes it difficult to have a global religion.
Thank you, Reverend. And now, Professor Mugambi.
Yes, maybe we are coming towards the end. I have also received queries about maybe some references. Maybe for those who are interested in following up this question, I would like them to refer to a book. It's available online. I think the older versions are even downloadable. The author is Jared Diamond the Mineral. Jared Diamond, J-A-R-E-D, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed is the title of the book. And he has now 12 societies that he has described, and he begins from the state of Montana in the northwest of the United States, where he grew up as a child. He said that it was the breadbasket of the Northwest, and it used to be a tourist attraction because the agriculture there was very, very good. But now it's a tourist attraction for the opposite reason, because it is desolate, nothing grows there anymore. And that made him want to study geography, population geography, and he's become an expert. In the description of the societies that he has listed, and the most recent was Rwanda in not far from Kenya, he notices that religion is implicated. When religion is critical, constructively critical, the society evolves well. But when religion becomes co-opted, it becomes worse than ideology, and the decline of the society is very rapid, to the point where religion itself destroyed together with the society. And that is the way he explains the rise and fall of societies and the rise and fall of religions worldwide. Maybe that is a good point to begin. And because he is not describing just Europe, he is not just describing Asia, he's not just describing Africa, and he is not a theologian, he's a population geographer. That is, I think, a very useful point to begin for those who are interested. And I thank the Columbia Global Center very much for making this space available. I hope that it will continue, because we are reinventing ourselves. Thank you.
Yes, and I thank you very much, Professor Mugambi, and I thank you, Reverend Cobia. I thank Professor Soret, who had to go on to another meeting. We are very, very grateful as well to our audience and your really thought-provoking questions. I just want to remind you that this webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube, and you receive a notification when that is available. I also remind you to please look out for the third in this series of lectures, which will be in about a week's time. We are just very, very excited about having Professor Mugambi continue discussing these issues. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to interacting with you in the near future. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.